The invitation arrived not by email, not through an aide, but with a handwritten note on official White House stationery, an old-fashioned gesture in an age of tweets and sound bites. Karoline Leavitt stared at it for a full minute before unfolding it. You are formally invited to the White House press forum with President Joseph R. Biden. Attendance is expected. That word, expected, pulsed in her mind. Karoline wasn't naive. She knew exactly what this was. A political setup disguised as a public forum. Ever since her fiery exchange with a CNN host had gone viral, the one where she dismantled media narratives in under 3 minutes, she'd become more than a nuisance. She was a threat. To the left, to the establishment, and apparently, to the president himself. But threats didn't retreat. She slipped the letter into her leather folder and turned toward her team. We're going. Her advisor, Nate, frowned. Karoline, it's a trap. You know that, right? Karoline offered him a thin, steely smile. Then let's make sure they regret setting it. 2 days later, she walked up the south lawn in a navy blue suit sharp enough to slice through tension. Camera crews tracked her every move, but she remained composed, eyes forward, chin high. The White House, bathed in morning sunlight, stood not as a symbol of power, but as a stage, and she had no intention of playing a supporting role. Inside, the East Room buzzed with anticipation. Reporters whispered, staffers adjusted mics, and Secret Service agents shifted in practiced patterns. At the front stood the president, flanked by aides, smiling. The kind of smile that said, "This is just another day, another script." But Karoline didn't come for the script. She came for the truth. And she carried one question in her mind, a question no one had dared ask aloud, one that struck at the very foundation of trust in leadership. And when she would speak it, the room would change. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. Not until the cameras rolled, not until Biden leaned forward and said, "Let's open the floor." Then Karoline raised her hand, and history braced for the question that would silence the most powerful room in America. As President Biden settled into his seat behind the White House press podium, the familiar rhythm of the daily briefing began. Flashes from cameras lit the room like a restless storm, reporters jostling for position, papers rustling, questions flying in rapid succession. It was business as usual, until Karoline Leavitt stood up. There was something different about her posture. Calm, composed, yet charged with energy. Her crisp blue blazer contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. She didn't shout to be heard. Instead, her voice sliced through the noise with a sharp clarity. "Mr. President," she began, her tone steady, "do you believe Americans should trust a leader who can't remember what he had for breakfast, let alone the state of the border?" The room fell dead silent. For a moment, Biden blinked. The press secretary froze mid-note. Cameras stopped clicking. All eyes locked on Karoline. Biden cleared his throat, chuckled lightly as if brushing it off, then reached for a familiar script. "I think that's, a loaded question, and let me just say, our administration has been transparent." But Karoline interrupted. "Transparent? Sir, Americans don't see transparency. They see confusion. They see a crisis at the border, a crisis in inflation, and a crisis in confidence. Are you willing to admit that your policies have created more problems than they've solved?" Reporters gasped. Some looked down, unsure whether to take notes or brace for fallout. CNN's camera operator zoomed in. Fox News' ticker began flashing the moment live. Biden's smile faded slightly. "I've led with compassion and competence." Karoline didn't let up. "But do compassion and competence look like record-breaking fentanyl crossings and small towns overwhelmed by border traffic?" The room grew thick with tension. Even seasoned journalists looked shocked. No one expected a press secretary to speak this boldly, certainly not to the president's face. The president sighed and reached for water. But Karoline wasn't finished. "Mr. President, Americans aren't looking for comforting slogans. They want accountability. So again, I ask, should they trust a leader who appears more lost than decisive?" A murmur rippled through the reporters. One whispered, "She just cornered the president." And in that moment, everyone knew. This wasn't just another press briefing. This was a confrontation that could echo far beyond those White House walls. The White House press room erupted as soon as the briefing ended. Reporters rushed toward the back, already phoning their editors. Camera crews scrambled to review the footage. And in the center of it all, Karoline Leavitt remained still, her eyes locked on President Biden as he exited through the side door, escorted by staffers whispering frantically into their earpieces. She didn't need to gloat. Her question had already done the damage. Fox News cut to commercial with a teaser. Karoline Leavitt stuns Biden. Did she just ask the question everyone's been avoiding? CNN tried to shift the narrative, their anchor muttering, "A tense moment at the White House," but President Biden remained calm under pressure. But even their tone sounded unconvinced. Karoline made her way out of the press room, her phone already buzzing with messages. Supporters, critics, political analysts, and conservative influencers flooding her inbox. One message stood out. That was a knockout. You didn't just ask a question. You exposed the silence. Outside, the sun lit up the north lawn as Karoline stepped into the view of a small group of reporters waiting for a follow-up. One from Reuters asked, "Was your question planned or a reaction?" She looked directly at the cameras. It was planned, because no one else is willing to say what Americans are thinking. The White House press corps has gotten too comfortable. "I'm not here to coddle the president. I'm here to hold him accountable." Her words shot through the media like wildfire. On Twitter, the hashtag #Caroline cornered Biden began trending. Conservative voices hailed her as fearless. Some liberals mocked her but couldn't deny her presence had shifted the tone of the briefing. Later that evening, Karoline appeared on Hannity. Sitting tall in the studio, she recounted the moment with calm resolve. "I didn't attack the president. I simply asked a question that deserved an answer. If he can't answer it, the American people already know the truth." Hannity leaned in, nodding. "You exposed what the administration keeps trying to hide." She smiled slightly. "The truth always finds its way out. I'm just speeding up the process." The clip went viral. Meanwhile, the White House scrambled. Staffers circulated talking points, prepping press allies to shift the narrative back in their favor. But behind closed doors, there was unease. Karoline hadn't just shaken a press conference. She'd shaken the image of control they were so desperately trying to maintain. The real story had just begun. The West Wing was a storm of tension. As dusk crept over Washington, the president's senior aides gathered in the Roosevelt Room, voices low but anxious. "She caught us flat-footed," said Communications Director Carla Gaines, tossing her glasses onto the table. "We prepped for foreign policy, not that." "She didn't ask a question," snapped another aide. "She fired a missile." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Karoline sat in a private office at the Federalist, reviewing clips of the press conference. Her team was electric, staffers relaying reactions from social media, television panels, and Capitol Hill. One of them turned the screen toward her. "She's getting traction across the spectrum," he said. Even CNN had to admit it shook the room. And the clip already has 4.7 million views. Karoline leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. That's because they saw it, they heard it, and they felt it. She wasn't wrong. Across the country, Americans were replaying her bold moment, dissecting every word. Pundits tried to spin it, claiming she had ambushed the president. But what struck people most wasn't just the confrontation. It was the clarity. The question she asked had exposed a vacuum, a silence, something the public had sensed, but no one had dared to say out loud. Back in the West Wing, the president sat with his chief of staff. "She's young," Biden muttered, "but she's sharp, and they're going to run with this." His chief of staff nodded grimly. "They already are." Somewhere between frustration and disbelief, they both understood. The battle wasn't over policies. It was over perception. And Karoline Leavitt had just redrawn the battlefield. The next morning, Karoline woke early to a fresh wave of headlines. "Leavitt's strike. A new generation takes the mic." Is this the future of conservative firepower? Biden shaken by simple question. But she didn't linger on the coverage. She was already writing her next statement. In an age where image is currency and words are weapons, Karoline had learned quickly. Timing, tone, and truth were everything, and she planned to use all three. Within hours, the political machine kicked into full gear. MSNBC anchors condemned her tone, suggesting Karoline's question had crossed a line. "Disrespectful," one host muttered. "Calculated aggression." But something strange began to happen. Viewers weren't buying it. Even traditionally liberal viewers began to ask, why didn't the president answer? The clip of Karoline's direct question played on loop, not because it was inflammatory, but because it rang with something America hadn't heard in a while: sincerity wrapped in nerve. Back at the White House, the press team scrambled to contain the fallout. A brief statement was issued. The president believes in respectful discourse and will address concerns through official channels. But the statement fell flat. Social media flooded with comments. Why not just answer her? She asked a question. That's her job. By noon, the hashtag #AnswerCaroline trended nationwide. Support came from unexpected corners: independents, Gen Z voters, even a few prominent journalists. That afternoon, Karoline sat in a studio, preparing for a primetime interview. The host looked at her, impressed. "You've done more with one question than most politicians do with 1,000 words?" Karoline smiled slightly. "Because I didn't go in there to perform. I went in to demand clarity for everyone who feels like they're not being heard." Her poise, paired with the raw boldness of her confrontation, had ignited something deeper than just a viral moment. It had pierced the echo chamber. Her question hadn't just unsettled Biden. It had unsettled an entire system used to silence young, challenging voices. Political commentators began rethinking their predictions. One analyst on cable news said, "She's not just a press secretary anymore. She's a force. And if Biden doesn't respond directly soon, this won't just be a moment, it'll be a movement." Karoline didn't blink when she heard that. She wasn't here for movements or moments. She was here for answers. And she wasn't done. That night, the nation watched. Karoline Leavitt appeared live on a major news network, the backdrop behind her a sleek city skyline bathed in deep blues and whites. The anchor wasted no time. "Karoline, let's get right to it. Why that question? Why that moment?" Karoline leaned in. Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to her voice, the kind sharpened not by arrogance, but by clarity. Because the American people deserve more than rehearsed slogans. They deserve accountability, and no one's above a direct question, not even the president. Clips played in real time, her voice echoing in the East Room. "Who are you really serving?" Biden's startled expression, the silence that followed. "She asked the question we've all been thinking," the anchor said. "Some say it was brave, others reckless." Karoline didn't flinch. "Then let history decide. But I'd rather be remembered for asking hard questions than for pretending nothing's wrong." At that moment, something shifted. It wasn't about party lines anymore. People at home, some lifelong Democrats, others staunch Republicans, paused and listened. The comment sections buzzed not with insults, but curiosity. Is she right? Why was there no answer? In a small-town diner in Ohio, an older couple watched the interview between bites of their meatloaf. The husband shook his head. "You know what? I may not agree with her politics, but she's got guts." In a college dorm in Michigan, students replayed the clip over and over. "She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She just stood there and asked the one thing no one dared ask." Karoline left the studio to find a line of reporters waiting for her. Microphones were shoved toward her, questions flying. "Will you apologize? Do you think the president was offended?" She stopped, turned to the cameras, and spoke without notes. "If the president was offended by a question from someone who represents the people, maybe he should ask himself why." Boom. Another clip, another round of retweets, another hour, and even international outlets picked it up. Leavitt's confrontation sends shockwaves through Washington. She didn't celebrate. She went home, kicked off her shoes, sat at her kitchen table, and reviewed notes for her next briefing. Because she knew, one question cracked the surface, but real change would take 10 more, maybe 100. She was ready. By morning, the West Wing was buzzing, not with routine, but with unease. In the press room, aides whispered behind coffee cups. Phones buzzed with alerts. Even seasoned staffers who had weathered countless controversies looked rattled. The headlines weren't letting up. Karoline Leavitt confronts the president on live TV, and the world watched. Silence in the East Room. Biden left stunned by unscripted moment. Is the White House losing its grip? Behind closed doors, President Biden met with his senior advisors. The room was tense, window shades drawn against the morning glare. He sat, arms crossed, rewatching the moment again, and again. She caught me off guard, he finally said, voice low. We weren't briefed she'd be there. Ron Klain, his former chief of staff brought in for the emergency debrief, offered a cautious response. With respect, Mr. President, it wasn't about her presence. It was about the question. No one's asked it that plainly before. The president looked out the window, then down at the notes in front of him. And now everyone's asking it. Meanwhile, Karoline's team was overwhelmed. Her communications director, a sharp young strategist named Dana, had to triple their staff to handle the surge of press inquiries. CNN wants her again. Fox, too. Even the BBC called, Dana reported breathlessly. Karoline didn't smile. No grandstanding. If I go back on air, it'll be to clarify, not to gloat. That afternoon, she returned to the Capitol for a scheduled hearing. What would have been a quiet subcommittee session turned into a full-on media spectacle. Reporters lined the halls, pressing their faces to the glass. She entered without a word, files in hand, focused. Inside, some lawmakers tried to bait her. One accused her of ambush tactics. Another called her a dangerous political opportunist. She didn't flinch. Asking questions is not ambush. It's called democracy. And if it rattled you, maybe ask yourself why. Every word was clipped and shared in real time. Hashtags trended again. Karoline speaks. Ask the question, not backing down. But Karoline knew better than anyone. This was just the beginning. A single question might grab attention, but sustaining trust, leading change, exposing patterns, those took more than one headline. Back at her office, she looked at her whiteboard. Written in thick marker were 3 words: truth, accountability, future. Underneath them, she scribbled a new line. What they fear isn't my question. It's that others might start asking it too. By the next morning, a subtle but unmistakable campaign had begun, one not waged on podiums, but in the shadows of Washington hallways and off-the-record calls. Emails leaked, anonymous sources emerged. Old footage of Karoline's college debates was pulled from archives, sliced and edited into misleading clips. A quiet effort was unfolding, to discredit her, to paint her as inexperienced, reckless, even dangerous. She noticed it first in the questions reporters started asking. Karoline, do you feel you're inflaming division? Some say you're trying to go viral rather than govern. What do you say to that? She kept her composure, but her eyes grew sharper. One night, she sat across from her husband, Ethan, the real estate developer who rarely commented on politics but could read people like blueprints. They're scared, he said, sliding her phone across the table. On it, a new headline flashed. Leavitt, unqualified or unstoppable. Karoline read it without blinking. They think I'll fold, that if they shout loud enough, I'll vanish. He leaned in. Will you? She shook her head. Number, I'm just getting started. The next day, she requested a meeting with 3 senior House Republicans behind closed doors. Her tone was focused, deliberate. This isn't about me. The American people saw what happened. They want more than rehearsed lines and press releases. If we don't start holding real conversations, we'll lose the country's trust. Permanently. One of the older members chuckled, clearly skeptical. You rattled the president. That was something. but it's not policy. She locked eyes with him. What good is policy if people stop believing in the people who make it? That line would be quoted endlessly for days. Meanwhile, the White House scrambled to shift the narrative. Psaki appeared on multiple news outlets, defending the administration, subtly implying that Karoline's confrontation was staged drama from an ambitious staffer. But the damage was done. Back in her office, Karoline's team was laying out a map, literal and strategic. Cities where voter confidence was dropping, states with growing independent numbers, young voters expressing frustration across platforms. Dana entered with a new poll in hand. Karoline, 68% say you asked the question they've been waiting years to hear, and the majority say they'd vote for someone like you. Karoline stared at the numbers. Someone like me? Or me? Dana hesitated, then smiled. I think they mean you. Karoline turned back to the window, eyes narrowing on the Capitol dome in the distance. They tried to silence a question. But what they've unleashed is a movement. The fallout from Karoline's bold question to President Biden had already sparked a national conversation. But what came next was something no one, perhaps not even Karoline herself, fully anticipated. Cable news continued their 24-hour loop. Conservative anchors hailed her as the voice of a silenced generation. Progressive commentators tried to downplay her impact, calling her a social media politician who got lucky in a moment of theater. But every time they mentioned her name trended higher. On Capitol Hill, staffers whispered her name like she was a storm forming on the horizon. Then came the rallies. The first one was in Pennsylvania. She hadn't planned it. It started as a local town hall, but the room filled beyond capacity, with overflow crowds standing outside in the freezing cold, listening on speakers. Karoline arrived in a green overcoat, flanked by minimal staff. No teleprompters, no flash. Just a microphone and fire in her voice. You don't have to agree with me, she told the crowd. But you have the right to demand straight answers from those who run your country. That shouldn't make headlines. It should be expected. The crowd erupted in cheers. Overnight, a dozen more town halls were requested. In Ohio, in Arizona, in Florida, all of them hosted by people, not party operatives, who just wanted someone to speak plainly again. But not everyone was celebrating. The White House communications team released a memo warning Democratic surrogates not to amplify the Leavitt incident. Internally, Biden's advisors debated whether to address it head-on or let it fade, but they underestimated how deeply Karoline's moment had cut into public consciousness. Then came the Washington Post op-ed. Written by a former Obama speechwriter, the piece was titled, A Dangerous Question or a Necessary One. It praised Karoline's courage while criticizing the administration's dismissiveness. It ended with a piercing line. The future of American politics may have walked into the White House briefing room wearing confidence in green and left carrying a torch. Karoline read it aloud in her apartment that night. Ethan, reading emails on the couch, glanced up. You just got compared to a revolution, she smirked. Revolutions are noisy. I just asked a question. But she knew better. It was never just a question. It was a spark, and now the fire was spreading. That week, Biden's approval ratings among independent voters slipped by 3 points. More telling was the quiet panic behind the scenes. Congressional aides leaked that the administration was scrambling for a new messaging strategy. Karoline, meanwhile, kept moving forward. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't throwing parties. She was reviewing legislative briefs, prepping for upcoming sessions, and, quietly, planning something bigger. Because this wasn't just about going viral. This was about building momentum, permanence. And they didn't see it coming. The White House briefing room stood empty now, its lights dimmed after another long day. But something in the air had shifted since Karoline Leavitt's confrontation with President Biden. Her question, simple, cutting, unforgettable, still echoed in headlines, in coffee shop debates, in Senate halls. A week after the incident, Karoline was invited to speak at Georgetown University. The audience was mixed: students, professors, skeptics, admirers. She stood under the stage lights, not with fiery rhetoric, but with quiet certainty. I wasn't trying to embarrass the president, she began. I was trying to represent the Americans who feel like no one asks what they would ask. The room fell silent, not in discomfort, but in respect. Back in D.C., aides huddled in closed-door meetings. One advisor reportedly told the president, "Sir, ignoring her might have been a mistake." Another added, "This isn't a moment. It's a movement." And they were right. Karoline's team had grown overnight. Young professionals from across the country reached out to volunteer. Donations poured in from small towns, $10 here, $25 there. No flashy PACs. Just ordinary citizens who saw something in her that politics had forgotten. Clarity. By the following month, she had launched a national speaking tour called Ask It Anyway. Each stop wasn't a performance, it was a conversation. People didn't come to cheer her, they came to ask their own questions. And Karoline? She answered. Every single one. Even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones. Meanwhile, President Biden, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative, scheduled a CNN town hall. But when the moderator broached the Karoline Leavitt incident, he stumbled. "I don't recall the exact phrasing," he muttered. She asked something inflammatory." Social media lit up again. "She didn't scream," one post read. "She just asked what millions were thinking." Karoline didn't respond. She didn't need to. The contrast spoke louder than any tweet. Then came the moment no one expected. An award from a nonpartisan watchdog group, Civic Courage Under Fire. She was the youngest recipient in the award's history. As she walked to the podium, the crowd stood. Among them were people from both sides of the aisle. Karoline looked out at them and said, "I didn't plan any of this. I just remembered that silence in politics isn't neutrality. It's complicity. And I chose to speak." A standing ovation followed. And in that moment, Karoline Leavitt didn't just belong in the political arena, she led it. In a room where silence once reigned, a single question sparked a national conversation. Karoline Leavitt didn't raise her voice, she raised the stakes. She reminded America that true leadership isn't about rehearsed speeches or party lines. It's about courage. It's about clarity. And sometimes, it's about asking the one question no one else dares to ask. She didn't just challenge a president, she challenged the system. And whether you agreed with her or not, you couldn't ignore her. Because truth, when spoken boldly, echoes louder than any applause. From the halls of power to the hearts of citizens, her words left a mark. And now, the question is no longer just hers. It belongs to all of us. What would you ask if the whole nation was listening? This was more than a moment. It was a turning point. This is Surprising Stories, where voices rise, where truths collide, and where one moment can change everything. Thanks for watching.